The Illuminati influence on international affairs. The United Nations. Tinbergen, from the Netherlands, the winner of the 1969 Nobel Prize for Economics, has said, "Mankind's problems can no longer be solved by national governments. What is needed is a world government." Although this mentality is becoming more pronounced, getting to that point has taken many years. In 1939, Dr. James T. Shotwell organized a group known as the Commission to Study the Organization of Peace, which was made up of a number of small subcommittees. One of these, the Subcommittee on International Organization, was chaired by Sumner Wells, the Under-Secretary of State, and its purpose was to plan post-war policy. Shotwell and Isaiah Bowman, members of the subcommittee, were also members of the League of Nations Association, and had been on Colonel House's staff at the Paris Peace Conference in 1918, where plans for the League of Nations had been laid out. This established a direct link between the League of Nations and the United Nations. The subcommittee's work formed the basis for the Charter of the United Nations, and was the means by which the Council on Foreign Relations was able to condition the Congress and the people of the country to accept the United Nations. 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, sent a letter to President Roosevelt recommending the establishment of a Presidential Advisory Committee on Post-War Foreign Policy, which actually became a planning group for the United Nations. 10 of the 14 committee members came from the CFR. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech planted the seed for the United Nations. A conference held in Washington, D.C. between the representatives of the 26 nations that had banded together against the Axis powers, gave momentum to the movement by issuing the Declaration of the 26 United Nations on January 1, 1942. In February 1942, the State Department's Advisory Committee on Post-War Foreign Policy secretly worked out more details. One of their reports said, its discussions throughout were founded upon belief in the unqualified victory by the United Nations. It predicted, as an absolute prerequisite for world peace, the continuing strength of the United Nations through unbroken cooperation after the war. In 1942, Free World, a periodical published by the International Free World Association, organized in 1941, they stated that their objective was to create the machinery for a world government in which the United Nations will serve as a nucleus, in order to prepare in time the foundations for a future world order. Leading diplomats from the United States, Russia, England, and China attended preliminary meetings in October 1943 at a conference in Moscow. In November, Cordell Hull secured the consent of Stalin to establish a general organization for the maintenance of international peace and security, and in proposing it to Roosevelt, made it appear as though it was an American project. Among the leading U.S. figures who were involved in the planning of the United Nations, Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Virginius Frank Coe, Noel Field, Lawrence Duggan, Henry Julian Wadley, John Carter Vincent, David Weintraub, Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, Harold Glasser, Victor Perlow, Irving Kaplan, Solomon Adler, Abraham George Silverman, William L. Ullman, William H. Taylor, and Dean Acheson. All of these men were either communists or had pro-communist sympathies. The idea for the United Nations was officially proposed in 1944 at the secret Dumbarton Oaks Conference, where the framework was developed and the final plans laid out. The conference was attended by representatives from the US, England, and Russia, and it was all coordinated by Alger Hiss. Hiss was a trustee of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, a director of the Executive Committee of the American Association for the United Nations, a director of the American Peace Society, a trustee of the World Peace Foundation, a director of the American Institute of Pacific Relations, and president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In 1950, he was convicted of perjury and sent to prison. Exposed as a Soviet spy, his communist activities extended back to 1939. Other Americans who attended: Harry Dexter White, Virginius Coe, Noel Field, Lawrence Duggan, Harry Wadley, John Carter Vincent, David Weintraub, Nathan Silvermaster, Harold Glasser, Victor Perlow, Irving Kaplan, Solomon Adler, Abraham Silverman, William Ullman, William Taylor, and John Foster Dulles, who had been hired by Joseph Stalin to be the Soviet Union's legal counsel in the United States. In February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin agreed to the plans proposing the establishment of the United Nations. The April 1945 issue of Political Affairs, the official publication of the U.S. Communist Party, said, "Great popular support and enthusiasm for the United Nations policies should be built up, well organized and fully articulated. The opposition must be rendered so impotent that it will be unable to gather any significant support in the Senate against the United Nations Charter and the treaties which will follow." On June 26, 1945, the San Francisco Conference, attended by 50 nations, established the United Nations, and adopted the charter which had been drafted. The General Assembly held their first meeting in London, on January 10, 1946. The U.S. Senate ratified the UN Charter with only 2 dissenting votes, and in December 1946, John D. Rockefeller III donated an 18-acre tract of land in Manhattan, which he had purchased for $8,500,000, with New York City contributing the remaining $4,250,000, to provide the organization with a permanent headquarters, which is located between First Avenue and Roosevelt Drive, and East 42nd and East 48th Streets. The United World Federalists were established on February 22, 1947, by 2 CFR members, Norman Cousins and James P. Warburg, when the Americans united for World Government, World Federalists, Massachusetts Committee for World Federation, Student Federalists, World Citizens of Georgia, and World Republic, all merged. Their goal was to endorse the efforts of the United Nations to bring about a world community favorable to peace, and to strengthen the United Nations into a world government of limited powers adequate to prevent a war and having direct jurisdiction over the individual. Nixon said of them, "Your organization can perform an important service by continuing to emphasize that world peace can only come through world law. Our goal is world peace." Ronald Reagan was associated with them before he became a conservative. Various other left-wing organizations have also defended and supported this international organization. The United Nations, open to all peace-loving nations as sovereign equals, is made up of 191 member nations, and exists primarily to maintain peace and security, develop international cooperation in solving the political, economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian problems of the world, and ensure the existence of friendly relations. Many of the countries are non-democratic, being ruled by dictators, royal families, military officers, or one-party governments. As you have read, there was a strong communist influence during the establishment of the organization, and all indications are that it has maintained a socialistic slant to its affairs. Earl Browder, a former leader in the U.S. Communist Party, said in his book Victory and After, "The American communists worked energetically and tirelessly to lay the foundations for the United Nations, which we were sure would come into existence." Alger Hiss, who was later convicted as a communist traitor, became the acting Secretary General after the establishment of the UN. The April 16, 1945 issue of Time magazine called him one of the State Department's brighter young men. It was Hiss, and Joseph E. Johnson, who later became Secretary of the Bilderbergers, who wrote much of the UN Charter, patterning it after the Constitution of Russia, and the Communist Manifesto. An Associated Press dispatch from April 7, 1970, which appeared in the Los Angeles Times, said, "Secretary General Youthant praised Vladimir I. Lenin, founder of the Soviet Union, as a political leader, whose ideals were reflected in the UN Charter." It contained self-granted powers for a one-world government. Even their official seal, which was similar to Russia's, was designed by Aldo Marzani, a socialist. Trygve Lie, the first official UN Secretary General, was a high-ranking member of Norway's Social Democratic Labour Party, which was an offshoot of the Third Communist International. Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General, was a Swedish socialist who openly pushed communist policies, and Youthant, the third secretary, was In 1978, Arkady Shevchenko, an ex-KGB agent, and Under-Secretary for Political and Security Council Affairs, who defected, said that many Soviet UN delegates worked for the KGB. With the United States having only one vote within the socialist-dominated organization, we were powerless to prevent the socialists from using diplomacy to achieve their goals. Non-aligned nations, a majority of the delegates, voted with the communists 85% of the time in the General Assembly, and in 1987, member nations voted with the US only 18.7% of the time. In fact, on key issues, the UN has voted against the United States nearly 85% of the time. The constitutional right of Congress to declare war has been completely transferred to the UN Military Committee, and as such, they can order us into war at any time, without our consent, as they did in Korea. The United States didn't make the treaty with Japan to end World War II, it was made with the UN. The UN refused to come to the aid of China in 1949, ignored the Hungarian freedom fighters in 1956, shunned the Tibetans when they were attacked by Chinese communists, and in the early 1960s, supported the communist attempt to overthrow the African country of Katanga. They even criticized the American invasion of Grenada, which sought to stem communist activity in the Caribbean. Remember, the Under-Secretary for Political and Security Council Affairs had always been a Russian, who along with the chairman of the UN Military Staff Committee was responsible for all UN military action. Prior to the Korean War, the chairman was Lieutenant General Alexander Vasilyev, who took a leave of absence from the position to command the communist troops, and actually gave the orders to attack. He continued to get valuable information about the UN's military plans from his hand-picked successor, General Ivan A. Sklero. In 1915, in number 40 of the Russian document The Socialist Democrat, Lenin called for a United States of the world. The Communist International in 1936 said that a world dictatorship can be established only by victory of socialism in different countries or groups of countries, after which the proletariat republics would unite on federal lines with those already in existence, and this system would expand, at length forming the World Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In the November 1946 issue of the communist publication Bolshevik, it said, "The masses know that peace is possible only on the basis of cooperation among the existing states. The Soviet Union is fighting to have the United Nations as effective as possible." On October 7, 1961, People's World, a West Coast Communist Party newspaper, published an editorial, "Save the UN," which said, "The UN commands a great reservoir of support in our country. People should write President Kennedy, telling him do not withdraw from the UN. Restore the UN to the grand design of Franklin Roosevelt, the design for peaceful coexistence." The preamble to the Constitution of the U.S. Communist Party urges the strengthening of the United Nations as a universal instrument of peace. The preamble of the UN Charter says, "We the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." In light of this, you should be aware of what Albert Einstein said after the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The secret of the bomb should be committed to a world government, and the USA should announce its readiness to give it to a world government. According to the Congressional Record of June 7, 1949, on pages 7356 and 7357, this was the wording for HCR 64, a joint resolution, corresponds to Senate Concurrent Resolution 56, the Toby or World Federalist Resolution, that was introduced in the House of Representatives. Resolved by the House of Representatives, the Senate concurring, that it is the sense of the Congress that it should be a fundamental objective of the foreign policy of the United States to support and strengthen the United Nations and to seek its development into a world federation, open to all nations, with defined and limited powers adequate to preserve peace and prevent aggression through the enactment, interpretation and enforcement of world law." Concerning this resolution, Cord Meyer, chairman of the National Executive Committee of the United World Federalists, said at a hearing before the Senate Subcommittee on the United Nations Charter, "We in the United States would be declaring our willingness to join with other nations in transferring to the UN constitutional authority to administer and enforce law that was binding on national governments and their individual citizens." By February 1950, after the public expressed their outrage over the resolution, the liberals who sponsored it turned their backs on it in an attempt to salvage their political reputations. Representative Bernard W. Carney, Republican, New York, said, "We signed the resolution believing we were sponsoring a movement to set up a stronger power within the United Nations for world peace. Then we learned that various organizations were working on state legislatures and on peace movements for world government action under which the entire U.S. government would be submerged in a super world government. Perhaps we should have read the fine print in the first place. We do not intend to continue in the role of sponsors of any movement which undermine U.S. sovereignty. Many congressmen feel as I do. We will make our position thoroughly clear." Within 2 years, 18 of the 23 states which had passed the resolution eventually rescinded it. Information about HCR 64, SCR 56 can be found in the infamous document No. 87, Review of the United Nations Charter, a collection of documents, by the Senate Subcommittee on the United Nations Charter, and published by the Government Printing Office in 1954. It was reportedly given to each of the senators at the time, and only 2 copies now remain in existence. This report blows the lid off of the U.S. government's determination for one world government. Also discussed are Senate Resolution 133, introduced July 8, 1949 by Senator Sparkman, Democrat from Alabama, who said, "We can create now, with Russia if possible, without Russia if necessary, an overwhelming collective front open to all nations under a law just to all." The report urged, p. 846, American atomic, military, and economic superiority is only temporary. It is essential before that superiority is lost that there be created an international organization with strength to enforce the peace. Senate Concurrent Resolution 57, introduced July 26, 1949 by Senator Kefauver, Democrat, Tennessee, called for an Atlantic Union of Canada, England, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the United States. The report said, p. 848, the establishment of a federal union would involve not only basic economic and social changes but also important changes in the structure of the United States government. It is very doubtful if the American people are ready to amend the Constitution to the extent necessary to give an Atlantic Union the powers it would need to be effective. Senate Concurrent Resolution 66, introduced September 13, 1949 by Senator Taylor, Democrat Idaho, called for the Charter of the United Nations to be changed to provide a true world government constitution. He claimed, only a true world government can achieve everlasting peace. The report stated, p. 850, anything less than world government would be merely a stopgap. The existence of document number 87 proves that the government of the United States and the political leaders of this country are working behind the scenes to strengthen the United Nations and to move towards one world government. In 1953, during the World Federal Government Conference in Copenhagen, Denmark, UN supporters revealed plans to push for a revision of the UN Charter, which would provide for the UN to become a world federal government with a world legislature and court, mandatory universal membership with no right of secession, and a full and immediate disarmament which would be militarily supported by the UN. Another conference, in London, in 1954, by the World Movement for World Federation, also proposed similar ideas. This movement to remove the sovereignty of the United States and member countries, convinced Senator John Bricker to propose his Bricker Amendment, which would have placed in the U.S. Constitution a safeguard against the possibility of a treaty which could result in a world government, a provision of a treaty or other international agreement which conflicts with this Constitution, or which is not made in pursuance thereof, shall not be supreme law of the land nor be of any force or effect. During debate on the bill, Senator Pat McCarran, Democrat Nevada, said of the powers provided to the UN by Articles 55 and 56 of the UN Charter, the Congress of the United States, because of the power granted to it by treaty, could enact laws, taking over all private and parochial schools, destroying all local school boards, and substitute a federal system. Congress could by law provide for censoring all press telegrams. Congress could utilize this power to put into effect a complete system of socialized medicine, from cradle to grave, even legislate compulsory labor, if it found that the goal of full employment required such legislation or would be served. The Bricker Amendment was opposed by all the One World organizations and internationalists like U.S. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, Senator Ralph Flanders, Republican Vermont, Senator Hubert Humphrey, Democrat Minnesota, John J. McCloy, former Assistant Secretary of Defense and former High Commissioner to Germany, Paul Hoffman, of the State Department, Thomas K. Finletter, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, and President Eisenhower, who said it would curtail the power of the presidency. After a long, bitter fight, the amendment failed by a vote of 60 to 31, just one vote short of the necessary two-thirds majority of the U.S. Senate. H.G. Wells wrote in his 1933 book The Shape of Things to Come, when the existing governments and ruling theories of life, the decaying religious and the decaying political forms of today, have sufficiently lost prestige through failure and catastrophe, then and then only will worldwide reconstruction be possible. Robert M. Hutchins, former president of Rockefeller's University of Chicago, was the chairman of the committee to form a world government, who had drafted a new constitution. On August 12, 1945, they said on a round-table broadcast, that they wanted to turn control of our nation over to a socialist world government. In Hutchins' 1947 book, The Constitutional Foundations for World Order, published for the Foundation for World Order, he says, tinkering with the United Nations will not help us, if we agree with the New York Times that our only hope is in the ultimate abolition of war through an ultimate world government. President Dwight D. Eisenhower said on October 31, 1956, I am more deeply convinced that the United Nations represents the soundest hope for peace in the world. A State Department document, number 7277, called Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World, revealed a plan to disarm the U.S. military, shut down bases, and to give the UN control of our armed forces, and nuclear weapons. The UN military arm would then be the world's police force to act as peacekeepers. The document, which on September 1, 1961, was sent by courier to the UN Secretary General, suggested a progressive reduction of the war-making capability of the nations and the simultaneous strengthening of international institutions to settle disputes and maintain the peace. It was to be done through a three-step program. The first stage would significantly reduce the capabilities of nations to wage war by reducing the armed force of the nations. Nuclear capabilities would be reduced by treaties, and UN peacekeeping powers would be strengthened. The second stage would provide further substantial reductions in the armed forces and the establishment of a permanent international peace force within the United Nations. The third stage would have the nations retaining only those forces required for maintaining internal order, but the United States would provide manpower for the United Nations Peace Force. The plan called for all weapons of mass destruction to be eliminated, except for those required for a United Nations Peace Force, page 12, first paragraph, and, on page 16, eighth paragraph, to keep the peace, all states will reaffirm their obligations under the UN Charter to refrain from the threat of use of any type armed force. I'm sure that this includes the disarming of American citizens. Sarah Brady, one of the leading proponents in this country against handguns, said, "Our task of creating a socialist America can only succeed when those who would resist us have been totally disarmed." Senator Joseph S. Clark of Pennsylvania said during a March 1, 1962 debate on the Senate floor, that the program is the fixed, determined, and approved policy of the government of the United States. The program was later revised in the Blueprint for the Peace Race, which said on page 33, the parties to the treaty would progressively strengthen the United Nations police force, until it had sufficient armed forces and armament so that no state could challenge it. The program was again revised by the present outline of basic provisions of a treaty on general and complete disarmament in a peaceful world. In 1961, during the Kennedy administration, Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy and Dean Rusk, all CFR members, initiated a secret study to study the direct and indirect ramifications of war, and how they could control the economy during peacetime. They wanted to know what situations the United States would be exposed to in the world if it moved from a period of war to a time of permanent peace, or as the report said, to consider the problems involved in the contingency of a transition to a general condition of peace, and to recommend procedures for dealing with this contingency. Conceivably, it would look for ways to slowly move this country into the New World Order. By 1963, 15 experts, known as the SSG or Special Study Group, from various academic fields, psychology, anthropology, international law, biochemistry, physics, astronomy, mathematics, literature, history, military, economy, sociology, and industry. Their first and last meeting had taken place at Iron Mountain in Hudson, New York, the first secure underground record storage center designed to protect vital corporate records in case of a nuclear disaster. There was some speculation that the think tank known as the Hudson Institute actually conducted the study. The institute was started in 1961, to help determine the entire future of the U.S., and time permitting, much of the world beyond. Many of their fellows and members belonged to the CFR. The long-term plan to control the population was said to have been completed in 1966. It was reported that President Johnson ordered the report to be sealed, because with the knowledge it contained, the American people could have used it to prevent the takeover of their country during the early stages. The cover letter of the report said, "Because of the unusual circumstances surrounding the establishment of this group, and in view of the nature of its finding, we do not recommend that this report be released for publication. Such actions would not be in the public interest. A lay reader, unexposed to the exigencies of higher political or military responsibility, will misconstrue the purpose to this project, and the intent. We urge that the circulation of the report be closely restricted to those whose responsibilities require that they be apprised of its contents." The report, in fact, appeared to be a blueprint for the future of this country, and contained recommendations that included plans for governmental control and manipulation, depopulation, gun control and disarmament, an international police force, and concentration camps. One man, calling himself John Doe, who was involved in the report, decided to release its contents. It was published in 1967 by Dial Press, a division of Simon & Schuster, as the Report from Iron Mountain on the Possibility and Desirability of Peace. Even though it was publicly renounced by the establishment as a hoax, it was translated into 15 languages. The SSG concluded that peace would almost certainly not be in the best interest of stable society, because war was too much a part of the world economy, and therefore it was necessary to continue a state of war indefinitely. War has provided both ancient and modern societies with a dependable system for stabilizing and controlling national economies. No alternate method of control has yet been tested in a complex modern economy that has shown itself remotely comparable in scope or effectiveness. War fills certain functions essential to the stability of our society. Until other ways of filling them are developed, the war system must be maintained and improved in effectiveness. In 1996, Simon & Schuster reprinted the report with a new introduction. Evidently, the germination of the report took place in 1966 when Victor Navasky, publisher and editorial director of The Nation, who was editor of the Monocle, a political satire magazine, read a New York Times article about the stock market declining because of a peace scare. Navasky said something to Lewin, who then wrote the report, and they presented the report to E.L. Doctorow, editor-in-chief, and co-conspirator, of Dial Press, who agreed to publish it as nonfiction. Navasky said the purpose of the hoax was to provoke thinking about the unthinkable, the conversion to a peacetime economy, and the absurdity of the arms race. However, some still believe the report to be authentic because a large portion of it has come to pass. At the Conference on Conditions of World Order, which met from June 12 to 19, 1965, which no doubt led to the establishment of the Club of Rome, at the Villa Cerboloni, facilities obtained through the Rockefeller Foundation, in Bellagio, Italy, which was sponsored by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, With a grant from the Ford Foundation and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, 21 scholars, writers and scientists from all over the world met to define the concepts of world order. A segment of their report, by Elio Jaguaribe said, "The establishment of world order depends not only on its intrinsic desirability and viability, but also on the support of men and groups who decide to dedicate themselves to the completion of such a goal. As increasing sectors of developed and underdeveloped societies begin to realize the urgent necessity of world order, the viability of its establishment, and the fact that it can be achieved by adopting measures which are reasonable in themselves, none of the governments will be able to escape public pressure for establishing world order. It is incumbent upon the intellectuals to play the decisive role in the formation of pressure groups in favor of world order. The establishment of world order demands the mobilization of groups dedicated to international pressure for the gradual implantation of that world order. The negotiated establishment of world order is theoretically possible and practically feasible since, in the last analysis, the probable effects of nuclear conflagration have made way an impractical alternative to the peaceful solution of contemporary problems." On May 18, 1972, Roy Ash of the Office of Management and Budget during the Nixon administration said, "Within 2 decades the institutional framework for a world economic community will be in place, when aspects of individual sovereignty will be given over to a supranational authority." ABC TV's Harry Reasoner, who later went to CBS, said on June 18, 1974, "The only eventual answer is some kind of world government, whether it is capitalist or communist." President Ford called for the development of a global strategy and a policy concerning food and oil, and President Carter, in what he called an Organization for the World Structure of Peace, tried to persuade the Chinese to take part. The Borger New Herald in Texas reported, "A meeting was held May 24, 1976 through July 4, 1976, in Valley Forge Park, King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, to formulate a new world constitution, elaborating a Bill of Human Rights for the world and setting up a permanent Secretariat of Human Rights there to superintend the government of the world." The World Constitution and Parliament Association, WCPA, located at 1480 Hoyt Street, Suite 31, Lakewood, Colorado, was established in 1959 by Philip Isley, who had emerged during the 1940s as a leader in the One World movement, as an organizer for the Action for World Federation from 1946-50 and the North American Council for the People's World Convention from 1954-58. The WCPA have assumed the task of trying to establish a new world order, and have assembled a provisional world parliament. Their original agreement to call a World Constitutional Convention was first circulated from 1958-61. Where it was signed by several thousand dignitaries. In 1965, work began on a world constitution, and a meeting was held in the City Hall of Wolfach, West Germany, in June 1968. A second meeting, known as the World Constituent Assembly, was held at Innsbruck, Austria, from June 16 to 29, 1977, to draft a constitution for the Federation of Earth, which was adopted by participants from 25 countries. It was revised in 1991. Reinhard Ruhe, president of the WCPA, said, "Only a full-scale world government will save the world from nuclear holocaust." The preamble of the Constitution began, "Realizing that humanity today has come to a turning point in history and that we are on the threshold of a new world order, which promises to usher in an era of peace, prosperity, justice and harmony. We, the citizens of the world, hereby resolve to establish a world federation to be governed in accordance with this Constitution for the Federation of Earth." A third session was held in January 1979, in Colombo, Sri Lanka, where a strategy was discussed on how to get the Constitution ratified by national parliaments and governments. There were 4 later meetings of the Provisional World Parliament: 1982, in Brighton, England; 1985, in New Delhi, India; 1987, in Miami, Florida; and 1996, in Innsbruck, Austria. A timetable announced in 1984 called for a world government to be instituted by 1990, which obviously didn't happen. They announced that when the Provisional World Parliament met for the 5th time, a world government would emerge. Well, they met on the island of Malta in 2000, and there is still no world government. So far, they have released 11 world legislative acts. They sent out a letter, dated December 12, 1990, to all presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, and other heads of governments and national parliaments. "We who sign this appeal to you, are ready for a democratic federal world government, under a ratified world constitution. Will you support this move for a federal world government? Will you appoint official delegates to the World Constituent Assembly? Now is the time to assure the dawn and full blooming of a new era for humanity on planet Earth." Not satisfied with how long it is taking the UN, the WCPA has been organizing for the time when they feel they can usurp existing sovereign governments. And they're pretty cocky about it too, because as far as the UN, they say, viable agencies of the UN, are transferred to the world government. The directorship of the WCPA is closely linked with the United World Federalists, the American Civil Liberties Union, Global Education Associates, Friends of the Earth, Planetary Society, World Watch Institute, Planetary Citizens, founded in 1974 by UN Executive Robert Mueller, author Norman Cousins, and activist Donald Keyes, to push for a one-world government by the year 2000, World Future Society, Planetary Initiative, American Movement for World Government, Rainbow Coalition, World Citizens Assembly, and others. Nearly 20% of their members are affiliated with the UN in various capacities. It is quite clear that America has become preoccupied with the goal of achieving peace in the world, and would do anything to accomplish that. President Truman said in 1948, "I would rather have peace in the world than be president." On another occasion he said, "Our goal must be, not peace in our time, but peace for all time." You thought, the third UN Secretary General said in 1969, "I do not wish to seem overdramatic, but I can only conclude from the information that is available to me as Secretary General that the members of the United Nations have perhaps 10 years left in which to subordinate their ancient quarrels and launch a global partnership to curb the arms race, to improve the human environment, to defuse the population explosion, and supply the required momentum to world development efforts. If such a global partnership is not forged within the next decade, then I very much fear the problems I mentioned will have reached staggering proportions that they will be beyond our capacity to control." In the quest for that peace, the United States has allowed itself to become weaker, and has ignored all the signs that along with world peace, will be a new world order dominated by a socialist form of government. In 1983, Elliot Roosevelt, the son of FDR, published a book called The Conservators, calling world government an immediate necessity. The United Nations is the root of that one world government, and since its inception, 17 of their agencies have been working toward that goal: International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, World Bank, which will place the financial power of the entire world in the hands of the UN, World Health Organization, to internationalize medical treatment, International Labor Organization, to standardize labor practices, International Monetary Fund, to promote international trade and commerce, World Meteorological Association, Universal Postal Union, International Civil Aviation Organization, World Intellectual Property Organization, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, International Telecommunication Union, International Fund for Agricultural Development, International Finance Corporation, International Development Association, Intergovernment Maritime Consultative Organization, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. Brock Chisholm, the first director of the UN World Health Organization, said, "To achieve one world government it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, their loyalty to family traditions and national identification." When he accepted an award from the World Federalist Association, CBS newscaster Walter Cronkite said, "We must strengthen the United Nations as a first step toward a world government. We Americans will have to yield up some of our sovereignty." The Ditchley Group, which first met in May 1982, at Ditchley Park in London, is engineering a plan by Harold Lever, a director on the board of the Unilever conglomerate, to control the fiscal and the monetary policies of the United States, and called for the International Monetary Fund to control the central banks of all nations. Representatives of 36 of the world's biggest banks met at the Vista Hotel in New York in January 1982 to lay the groundwork, then met again in October, where it was reported that plans were underway to bring legislation before the U.S. Senate that would designate the IMF as the controller of U.S. fiscal policy by the year. On January 8, 1983, Hans Vogel of the Club of Rome met at the White House with President Reagan, Secretary of State George Shultz, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, George Kennan, and Lane Kirkland, President of the AFL-CIO, to discuss the objectives of the Ditchley Group. The group met on January 10 to 11, 1983 in Washington to discuss the IMF takeover, and later in the year, in Williamsburg, Virginia, with a group of international bankers, to discuss a disintegration of the U.S. banking system which would force the Senate into accepting IMF control. Dennis Weatherstone of Morgan Guaranty said that this was the only way for the U.S. to save itself. The propaganda of world peace propels the United Nations further into the control of this world, and what negative publicity has emerged, has done little to slow its momentum. Originally the UN wanted the United States to pay 50% of their budget, but eventually, negotiations lowered the amount to 39.89%. Later it was lowered further to 25%, or about $3.9 billion. At one point, the Soviet Union was only paying 13%, Japan, 10%, West Germany, 8%, Great Britain, 4%, and Saudi Arabia, 5%. The 100-plus third world non-aligned countries were only paying 9%, yet controlled 3/4 of the voting power in the General Assembly, and the 80 poorest countries were contributing less than 1% of the UN budget. In September 1983, the Senate introduced legislation that sought to cut the U.S.'s contribution by 21% for 1983-84, and 10% more for each of the following 3 years, which would make America's portion of the UN budget less than 15%. The United States further showed their displeasure with the United Nations, when in December 1983, the Reagan administration announced it was withdrawing from UNESCO, because the UN agency had increasingly placed an overfed bureaucracy at the service of a coalition of Soviet bloc and Third World countries, which was to be effective January 1, 1985, unless reforms were made. UNESCO was labeled by newsman Paul Harvey as communism's trap for our youth. Another area which demonstrated the UN's communist leanings was revealed by the McGraw-Edison Committee for Public Affairs. The United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, appropriated $59 million between 1947 and 1958 to communist countries. In a ratio not unlike that of other UN ventures, the United States has furnished $42 million of the money. As with other aid programs, the assistance does not go to the needy, but it is administered through governments. Since the establishment of the UN, up to 1991, there were 157 wars. J. Reuben Clark Jr., ambassador to Mexico, and Under-Secretary of State, in his August 1945 analysis of the UN Charter, wrote, "The Charter is built to prepare for war, not to promote peace. The Charter is a war document, not a peace document." He is quoted, pg. 27, in the book The United Nations Today as saying, "Not only does the Charter Organization, UN, not prevent future wars, but it makes it practically certain that we shall have future wars, and as to such wars, it takes from us, US, the power to declare them, to choose the side on which we shall fight, and to determine what forces and military equipment we shall use in the war, and to control and command our sons who do the fighting." Former President Herbert Hoover said in an August 10, 1962 speech, "I urge the ratification of the United Nations Charter by the Senate. But I stated at that time the American people should be under no illusions that the Charter assures lasting peace. But now we must realize that the United Nations has failed to give us even a remote hope of lasting peace. Instead, it adds the dangers of wars which now surround us." An article about the UN in the March 2, 1964 edition of the Santa Ana Register made this comment. "The whole purpose and, indeed, the method of the UN is to use armed might against any nation presumed to be an aggressor. Its function is to make war. Representative John E. Rankin, DMS, 1921-53 said, "The United Nations is the greatest fraud in all history. Its purpose is to destroy the United States." According to the March 9, 2003 edition of the Washington Times, Representative Ron Paul, RTX, said, "I think the United Nations is dangerous to our republic and therefore we ought not to participate." As long as prominent members of our government and our uninformed elected representatives continue to tout the United Nations as being the only way for lasting peace, then the propaganda will continue to grow, and we will become more desensitized to the campaign that continues to slowly take away the freedoms that our forefathers fought and died for. While campaigning for the presidency, Bill Clinton said, "My vision is that we would become an instrument working as much as possible through the United Nations for freedom and democracy and human rights and global economic growth." In a speech to the World Affairs Council in Los Angeles, Clinton called for a permanent UN rapid deployment force. Richard Gardner, a Clinton advisor on the UN, and a professor of international law, has outlined a plan for a world army of 30,000 men. The 5 member nations of the Security Council would provide 2,000 men, and 30 other nations would add up to 750 each. This would create a military force that the Security Council could deploy within 48 hours to maintain the peace. In a February 1, 1992 speech to the UN General Assembly, President George Bush said, "It is the sacred principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter to which the American people will henceforth pledge their allegiance." In 1993, the UN became financially stretched to the limit, because of all the peacekeeping operations throughout the world, numbering about 70,000. They pay each country $988 per soldier every month, and more for specialized troops, which forced it to cut back on travel, meetings, and the use of consultants. While the US is still paying about 25% of its annual budget of over $1 billion, and about 30% of all peacekeeping costs, a move was on to force member nations to contribute a portion of their defense budgets to the UN. According to the January 16, 1996 Washington Times, it was announced that Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali urged the UN to consider imposing its own taxes to become less dependent on the United States. We can expect one of two things to happen in the future. Either the UN will steadily grow in power, until it evolves into a one-world government. Or if perceptions continue that it has not lived up to expectations, it could be disbanded, perhaps if the United States would drop out, and replaced by an already burgeoning alliance, such as the WCPA. Walter Hoffman, the executive vice president of the World Federalist Association, wrote in a letter to a national news magazine, that we need a new, more effective UN, one that will have the power to stop wars and arbitrate disputes between national groups. It seems likely that the strength of our economy may determine how soon our country agrees to become part of a one-world government. If it continues to decline due to government mismanagement and manipulation by the Illuminati, it may not be long till we have to be saved in order to survive, even if it is, as part of a new world order dominated by a socialistic political ideology.